Thank you. I'm honored to be with you all. This presentation is called The Analog Ends of Science, with the subtitle, Investigating the Analogy of the Laws of Nature through Harman and Gilbert Simondon. While thinking about the theme of this conference, about whether science should be taken literally or somehow metaphorically, my mind gravitated to the following enigma: the metaphor of the laws of nature, as used by scientists and scientific literalists, without question, without digging into the roots of this most common analogy. So where does this analogy come from? Can I take some of this water? It comes from, of course, the ancient idea of the world as a cosmic justice system. In fact, the oldest known fragments of philosophical prose that we have describe causality in exactly these terms. Anaximander writes, "Things pay penalties and are judged for their injustices according to the ordinance of time. Causality is first presented as equal and opposite, blow for blow, eye for eye justice." To see how all this relates to object-oriented ontology, Simondon, and the burning question of reading science literally, let's briefly survey the history of thought through this prime lens of justice. This ancient thought was central not only to the scientific concept of natural laws, but also religion's revelations about absolute autonomy. Autonomy meaning self-legislator, namely in the form, obviously, of God, this original legislator and highest judge of existence. This early conception of justice was also crucial in the birth of philosophy, as we're about to see. It began, I think, with the obscure priestess named Diotima, as she taught her student Socrates the dialectic of beauty, the idea that beauty itself inclines from particular bodies, beautiful bodies, to beautiful souls, to the beautiful in itself. Philosophy proper begins when Socrates turns this very method onto the ideal of justice and its justifications. This presented justice itself as an autonomy, irreducible to physical laws, mystical experiences, political uses, or sophistical theories of it. This strange defense of the autonomy of ideals was the first great success of philosophy, but not without struggles and not forever. Plato's dream of building a kingdom out of such ideals failed almost immediately. I heard there was like one proto-king who was quickly exiled. And then after Aristotle, idealist philosophy gradually becomes, I think, retrofitted to defend authorities like empires and religions. And there's an underground current also of Neoplatonism. This changed with the scientific revolution, which challenged these authorities with the undeniable fruits of technical invention. And mechanical materialism thus revitalized the concept of natural laws as the literal truth of reality. In response, idealism pivoted from defending the elusive autonomy of a creator over creation toward the more modest independence of the human from nature. Meillassoux aptly terms this form of idealism today as correlationism, since it defends against the literalist that we cannot know the nature of reality in itself, but only its distorted correlations for us. So the state of philosophy today rests in a kind of stalemate between these two impoverished views. And this brings us to OOO, object-oriented ontology, a philosophy which cannot rightly be classified as idealist nor materialist, literalist nor correlationist. Harman summarizes his philosophy in perfect tandem with the history I just sketched. "I defend the integrity," he says, "the autonomy of objects from all qualities, all relations, and all possible uses that can be made of them." What Socrates did for the ideal of justice, Harman turns onto things themselves. This philosophy thus presents a unique minimal measure, I think, for autonomy. For OOO locates it in the merest irreducibility of things to one another, while these other theories always reduced things to something ulterior. Materialism, of course, obscured the autonomy of objects by undermining, right? By reducing things down to their constituent parts, mindlessly obeying the laws of nature. And idealism obscured the autonomy of objects by overmining, by reducing things up to an idea in the mind of a superior being who possessed a functional monopoly on autonomy, the power to legislate the world. For OOO, all these philosophies have committed the original sin of ridding the world of objects, right? And just as Heidegger showed that the independent reality of the hammer withdraws beyond our finite mastery as it breaks in our hand, O maintains that all objects have only a finite form of power. There can be no direct knowledge of nor mastery over things themselves. The strangest consequence of this insight, which ignited the central question of this conference, is this. In the same way that we helplessly distort reality into our own finite terms, our own finite human terms, all things can only relate by translating according to their own finite terms. Keeping with Marshall McLuhan's definition of metaphor as seeing one thing through the lens of another, this model of causation is expressly analogical. Causation is aesthetic. All in all, we thus find there's an aesthetic limit to knowledge, and so also science. And this is why Harman famously deems aesthetics first philosophy. But of course, what does this entail for the status of scientific knowledge, right? It would seem to imply that science is just one aesthetic translation equivalent to any other, that facts are, in the deepest sense, fictions. Harman himself makes plain the stakes of this, stating in his recent object-oriented ontology theory of everything, every philosophical position leaves new problems in its wake, and one of the problems facing O is undoubtedly whether it does justice to literal knowledge. And this is where Gilbert Simondon comes in. He was known as kind of an obscure influence on Gauss Deleuze. He was a French philosopher of information, largely ignored during his lifetime. And this is where he enters the picture. First, an interesting coincidence I found between Harman and Simondon. Their first major works have almost exactly synonymous titles. That is, Harman's Tool Being and Simondon's On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects. Already you may notice a difference in their styles, just a smidge. More interestingly, these titles even mean the same things for both philosophers, as both center around discerning the autonomy of tools for many theories or uses of them, and then applying this same measure to being throughout the cosmos. So both philosophies begin with a flat metaphysical system, but where Harman champions objects ontologically irreducible to one another, Simondon praises discrete streams of information, which are irreducible to any static structures whatsoever, whether laws, theories, or even rigid objects. More systematically, to get in the weeds a little bit, whereas Harman's schema is made up of 4 ontological poles constituting objecthood, Simondon's is critical of ontology in favor of what he calls ontogenesis, and his schema consists of 3 phases of becoming. There's this pre-individual phase of what he calls supersaturated solution. It's kind of like the apeiron. Actually, he calls it the apeiron of points. And this is the potential where no objects have yet formed. Sorry, puberty. The next phase is the individuating phase, where beings crystallize from this solution into actual forms. And then there's the trans-individual phase, where this surplus carries forth as a resonance between beings, but without dissolving them into each other or crystallizing them into one another. So again, there's a kind of flat ontology of discrete beings here, at least a recognition of discrete beings. And I found that they also share another key notion here, aesthetic or analogical causation. That there's no relation without distortion, without translation, or as Simondon calls it, transduction. Amazingly, Simondon even defines philosophy as the aesthetics of aesthetics. For Simondon, analogical information is the fundamental legislative power in the cosmos. Information writes, alters, and erases the laws of nature. But if this philosophy shares the same principle of aesthetic causation, how does it do better justice to scientific knowledge than O? Well, it begins with intent. Harman makes clear that for him, philosophy is not the handmaid of science any more than of religion. But science for Simondon is the highest, yet not authoritative, not the final say, of analogical cognition. In fact, he spends most of his major works constructing a theoretical supplement to science called Alligmatics. Throughout his magnum opus, another long title here, he loved these, Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information, the tongue breaker. Simondon shows how analogies are used in all areas of science. There are the obvious analogies like light to sound, or both light and sound to waves of water, or the fabric of space-time. But more profoundly, his work centers on the way scientific processes must begin analogically from a presuppositionless sensitivity, how it must conjure fresh comparisons, continually reinvent hypotheses, and all of this while also attaining the rhetorical metaphors required to present the work in an intelligible and reproducible fashion. Science is an ongoing method that is a dynamic operation, and therefore irreducible to its results. It cannot be collapsed to any final structure once and for all because it studies ongoing real information, or individuation, as he calls it. Science only produces what he calls virtual stabilities. Rather than being literal, science is a constantly expanding infrastructure made of robust analogical links. In his own words, science is a system of all virtualities, accumulated and linked to one another, and tends toward virtual that is always available and present everywhere, corresponding to, in quotes, the laws of nature. As I began understanding all of this in Simondon, my mind circled back to O, trying on theme to translate these insights into O's own terms. And after racking my brain for an embarrassing amount of time, I finally realized, if you're familiar with O, you know the four poles of relation between objects and qualities: essence, time, space, which is allure itself, and eidos. Eidos, aka theory, is perhaps the most understudied tension in the fourfold. From Plato onward, this term has indicated visible yet not physical form. My claim here will be that eidos is O's own model of virtuality, of intelligible form, and that this virtuality is best viewed as a special, narrow form of aesthetics, actually, almost an anesthetic aesthetics, which strips beings of their underlying dynamism and finitude to cold, pure, abstract outlines. To see how this narrowed form of analogy works, let's look closer at the term analogy itself. It means in proportion, in ratio. Aristotle defined it midway between the intelligible, or rather the unintelligible, and the commonplace. Metaphor produces the most of knowledge. So we find here a ratio within analogy, stretching from the illogical to the logical. So let's see this in action. And I actually wrote this before Graham gave his example of a pen and pencil the other night. So if I say something like, this pen is a zebra, your mind likely hits the brakes. You begin to presume I'm speaking nonsense. But when I say this pen is a sword, you put together, I'm using an analogy of some sort, sharp cutting qualities are being wielded. And as we begin to move closer to the form of the pen, we note a phase shift in analogical cognition from allure toward eidos. A flip happens here. So when I say this pen is equal to a pencil, it is understood without resistance that there is an operational equivalence, as Simondon would say, between them, writing tools. Right? Finally, when I say this pen is equivalent to that pen, we near the literal kinship of these forms, meaning even though they're physically distinct, there's still some analogical cognition going on associating this pen with another, or even the word pen with the pen, right? So this spectrum can also be expressed in the thermodynamic measure for information that Simondon uses, from entropic surprisal, pen is a zebra, to negatropic redundancy, pen equals pen, right? Meaning, this negatropic redundancy is a reduction of sensuous surprise. Regularity and redundancy cool information into eidetic form. The difference between literality and metaphor, then, is like that between seeing a thing on a developed photograph, eidos, versus seeing that same thing through an open lens, allure. Both distort, but we can distinguish a deep asymmetry here. Just as there can be no photograph without first an open aperture, there can be no eidos without first allure, no redundancy without first a surprise. So analogy can give rise to logic, but logic cannot give rise to analogy. Although scientific knowledge does not capture reality in itself, and is rather like a high-resolution development of information, meaning redundant information, And in the same manner that a bundle of sticks is stronger than one, or that two-factor authentication just is more secure than single-factor security, scientific justification finds its veracity, I think, in sheer redundancy. Thus, a fact is not essentialist fiction akin to any other, but requires a strict rapport of operational correlations, which are held together with the redundantly observable qualities and a stable virtual object. So, in other words, we should trust science to the maximal extent we trust our senses and falsifiable theories. It's the very best of these. But the facts which mark this limit of scientific knowledge are not equal to reality itself, any more than a mathematical model of an apple is the same as an apple. In the simplest terms, science expands but never escapes the correlationist circle. But the perpetual problem is that we forget the analogical basis of eidos, of literalized cognition as such. The eidos of science is paradoxically good as knowledge, but bad as metaphysics, because it crystallizes its dynamisms and obscures its autonomies. The laws of nature obscure autonomy from the picture. This is why Harman says, only philosophy, not physics, can do justice to physis, which means nature. For both thinkers, philosophy means beginning with analogy, which entails a humility of sorts, or astonishment and openness to surprise, rather than the pretense of a final mastery or knowledge. Philosophy turns us from the attempt to justify final truths toward the more humble attempt of doing justice to reality. Reversing the literalist reduction of metaphysics to physics, that is, reading these metaphysics we've just covered as physics, we see these two systems challenge the atomistic quantizing of mechanical theories, while also dividing the all-too-virtual fabric of space-time into its proper jurisdictions, namely by Simondon's notion of pure information, or metastability, which defines an autonomy as that which holds its parts and relations in a cooperative tension, kind of like the spring we were mentioning earlier. And by Harman's black hole alternative to this pure information, where an autonomy is defined as withheld independence beyond its parts and relations, for which I'd like to propose the technical term superstability. While Harman would criticize Simondon of undermining things to their pre-individual genesis, Simondon would retort that Harman overlooks precisely what needs explained the most, how objects ever come to be in the first place, individuation. But despite their disagreements, these two theories, I think, render the most granular measures of autonomy that I've found in the history of philosophy. As for both realisms, the laws of nature are legislated and enforced by discrete beings and nothing besides. Space opens and time pours from things themselves. And I call the overlap the nickname for these philosophies, analog realism, since they both view causation as a distortive analogical transfer of proportionate information, like a vinyl record, has the grooves which are proportionally transferred to the waves, of the speaker. And because they simultaneously maintain that these signals are generated not by analogies or virtualities all the way down, but bottom out at analog autonomies. Such realities and their necessarily aesthetic relations are the analog ends of science. I want to conclude briefly by returning to the beginning theme of this presentation, cosmic justice. We have certainly seen these philosophies do better justice to the legislators of the cosmos, but a remaining question looms. Do these philosophies do justice to justice? Unfortunately, we don't have time for the full scope of this question, so we'll just focus on one small aspect here. If we take aesthetics as first philosophy, or rather, the aesthetics of aesthetics, it's reasonable to begin, I think, from this sense of harmony and injury, justice and injustice, which are perhaps the most potent aesthetic experiences one can have. So far, we have seen these philosophies work as a kind of science of science, insofar as they recursively ask, is this truth, taken as literally, true? Is this truth true? Conversely, the aesthetics of aesthetics would ask, is this value valuable? Or maybe, what is the value of values? For Simondon, the answer is pretty clear. This question naturally inclines, somewhat similar to Diotima's ascent, toward a virtual God, akin also to Meilsu's divine inexistence, a God that does not yet exist, but it's a virtual attractor for existence. Though he's unclear whether this can actually come about in reality. For Harman, I found a short passage where he describes the core inspiration, or a core inspiration for his fourfold philosophy in, I quote, Heidegger's own concept of justice, which holds together four constituent terms in a kind of permanent strife or instability. Without the preservation of these four tensions in reality, all legislation, all causation collapses immediately and indefinitely. So there is a kind of justice to these tensions, no doubt. But what of a positive cosmic justice, a value of values? Could there be such a thing for O? It obviously can't be something like, let's give equal rights, equal care to all objects, right? That would be absurd. But why exactly is this so absurd? This seemingly absurd question actually implies a profound distinction, one between autonomy and responsibility. For while all beings are granted their world legislative power here, how many are concerned with legislating justly? This is no abstract concern, too, given, for example, the daily expanding autonomy of artificial intelligences, which may prove to be the ultimate aim of science, of technology at least. We find that the responsibility for aligning such autonomies, for aesthetic engineering and architecting a world of justice, falls completely outside of science's study of the laws of nature and into the doubly aesthetic domain of conscience. Thank you.
Anyway, we have time for, we have 21
Thanks for the talk, very interesting. I was a bit confused, let's say, by the equivalent use of analogy and metaphor.
Oh, yeah.
But like your talk made me think about Nicholas Hughes, who introduced analogy as the concept of unequal equality.
Unequal equality.
Because, so he introduced it in order to talk about God, but in a way that is unequal to God, but still refers to God. But the most interesting part about it is he based his mathematical system on this concept of unequal equality, which eventually led to differential equations and it informed much of science vocabulary. But for that reason, I always saw analogy as like the middle ground between literal and metaphorical, because analogy is sort of an equation, an unequal equation about something. And metaphor, in my view at least, it's more of a pointing towards, it's more of an indication. And I also wanted to ask this yesterday about if there is any difference between analogy and metaphor in your own work.
I would say for me, first of all, they are synonymous, and I think the reason they're synonymous for me is one, from Marshall McLuhan's definition of metaphor, seeing one thing through the lens of another, that anything that is this translative act, right? I take that as aesthetic, right?
Thank you.
Are you familiar with Noah Roderick's book, The Being of Analogy?
No.
Oh, from Open Humanities Press, a series on editing. You might enjoy that.
Yeah.
He did it from a triple O angle also.
Oh, cool.
What
was it called again?
The Being of Analogy, Noah Roderick. Yeah, no, those books are free online. You can get a PDF anytime.
Sweet.
I was just going to respond to the point about individuation, because this is another critique that comes up of triple O a lot from a Simondonian standpoint. And I think the reason I haven't talked much about individuation is because for me an object comes from the conjunction of previously existing objects. And so there isn't some pre-objective dimension where that happens that needs a special philosophical treatment. And I think the reason I've been inclined in that direction is because there is the undermining tendency that when people who take a historical approach to objects tend to forget how much the history of a thing is forgotten by the thing. Right, so Delanda as an example, he claims that all that individuates helium atoms is their individual histories. Whereas I would say that reality doesn't remember all the history that gave rise to much is forgotten. And whereas in the Bergsonian tradition, you get this theory of universal cosmic memory so that everything's inscribed somewhere. I don't think that's the case. I think some things just vanish without leaving a trace. And I think most things vanish without leaving a trace. Like in the case of the Dutch East India Company, you don't need to look at every battle or every contract or business deal it made. You just need to find the things that changed it irreversibly. But that, I suppose, you could still make a Simondonian case that I should say more about individuation. But the reason I haven't talked about it is this.
Yeah, that's interesting. So for Simondon, he has that idea of the apeiron, right? And it's not exactly a temporal thing. He says it's prior to both space and time. Somehow it is this kind of fundamental layer that objects come from. And so in its place, in place of the apeiron, for you, is there just a literal eternity of objects in the past? Yeah.
Eternity?
Yeah. Would you say there would be an eternity? It would seem to me that would be what's implied, right? That there's an eternity of objects. There's no first object.
Oh, in that sense, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. And that gets into the thing yesterday about how science and philosophy work on with different constraints.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously you don't want to be saying that animal species are eternal anymore, and you don't want to be saying that that information is transmitted at infinite speed, because Einstein made that impossible. But can you say there is no beginning in time, even though current cosmology is based on the Big Bang? Mm-hmm. I think you can. And triple O implies that time travel is not possible. So is that falsifiable by technology? Mm-hmm. But yeah, triple O implies that there's no particular first point in time. Kant says you can never answer that. I think you can, not that you can know it for sure. But
I'm asking more questions over here, but is there a difference for you between aesthetics and analogy, by the way? Or metaphor and analogy?
No, metaphor and analogy I use synonymously also, but it's aesthetics and analogy. Aesthetics is the broader term.
Yeah.
So I guess I wanted to pick up on the answer to Graham gave to Lisbon and something you said. And apologies if I'm not completely immersed in all of this literature, because I'm sort of an Arab philosopher, not an active one. But it seems that Graham said that there is some natural carving up of things in some sense. So when you were answering Razvan, I don't remember exactly the phrase you used, but that in relation, or at least in thinking, let's say, about science, it's not that there's some arbitrary space of natural objects. I don't want to misphrase you, but I want to make sure I'm in the right direction.
If humans arbitrarily cut the world into parts?
You said that it's not the case that we can just arbitrarily do that, right? And you're suggesting, I think, here in a similar way that the analogy structures have some spread between pencil is like a pencil, or pen is like a pen, to a pen is like a sword, and this seems to be...
It's not arbitrary.
Yeah, non-arbitrary. It seems to be privileging, and it seems to be, and now I'm going to go back to my philosophical space. It seems like in some ways related to what I think of as my tradition of sort of transcendental idealism, where there is something out there that does provide some constraints. And exactly how we want to cash that out is open for discussion. But at the same time, at least when I've been reading about OO and when I've been thinking about the kinds of debates that seem to be going on in this space, that seems to be a tension that's trying to be removed. And specifically when it comes to thinking about science, this tension seems to matter.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things I found interesting is that Miriam was saying, okay, we don't want to privilege introspection, our own cognitive space, because it's also imperfect. But then where do we start thinking about where that space, that analogical space is, or the fact that we do have constraints about how we carve things up? So I'm trying to understand this tension.
No, I agree. Yeah, it is very complicated. I think what I like so much about Simondon's answer, it's the best that I've personally found, is that it's non-arbitrary to the extent science and scientific knowledge is non-arbitrary to the extent that it's redundant. And this redundancy is found in all kinds of ways, right? This redundancy is found through repeatedly observable experiments, that sort of thing. And also, I mean, just using the same language over time. That has an element of non-arbitrariness, you know? It's we're putting our pins on the map with each other, right?
But you were talking about this as a practice, so to push a little more.
Sure.
You could imagine a case where people repeatedly do a badly designed experiment with some bad conceptualization and produce the same thing,
Right.
but that isn't predictive about or networked to the larger space of how we think about things in science. So
Right.
at the level of the community or at the level of its respecting other regularities in the world,
Right.
it would break. And so it seems to go beyond just repeatability.
Sure, yeah. So I had to cut for time, but another element to this is Simondon, it's redundancy on multiple orders of magnitude, right? And so for him, his own initial schema is it has to work on at least these three levels, you know, the pre-individual, the individuating, and the trans-individual. And so that would suggest you can't have just, you're repeatedly doing this same experiment and you keep getting, you know, your own arbitrary reading on top of it. The trans-individual is also what he calls the social. It needs to be tested redundantly against other beings, against other human beings, against other perspectives. And that's why he thinks it's an ongoing process as well. Right? So I don't know if that fully answers.
Yeah, I think that does. But then I guess I'm trying to figure out whether that's in tension with OOL.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if you would want to, okay, yeah, we're sort of a little bit over, so one last
No,
quick.
it's following the question. I think that you're overlooking a very important element in Simondon's philosophy, because you're just mentioning these three phases.
Yeah.
But the individual one, Simondon distinguishes between the individual and the process of individuation.
Yeah.
He distinguished that. And within process of individuation, he distinguishes as well the physical phase, biological phase,
Yes.
psychic phase,
Absolutely.
collective,
Yeah.
and only then
Absolutely.
came up.
No, that's an important point.
And science would belong exclusively to the psycho-collective
Yeah.
process of individuation,
Right.
and that understanding of the trans-individual would also be more or less understood as history in a very broad sense.
Sure, yeah, and also, no, absolutely, you're right. More granularly, that is the practice. In practice, he shows we move from the pre-individual to this trans-individual. He thinks reality itself is structured in this way, but science in particular, and its quest of doing a genealogy, essentially, because that's what you're referring to, talking about the physical, and then the psychic and the social. He has these various steps. And in these steps, he actually says that, yes, this is part of the individuating process, and it's a process which is beginning from this pre-individual super solution, supersaturated solution. So it still does have this threefold structure intact, right? That's what's really central to him. But through the evolution from the physical, say, to the vital, to the thinking being, to the social being, there's an increase in autonomy. That's what's central to him. That's what is, that's his main focus with describing the process of individuation, right? Is he's trying to, and so he's saying, we go from stability, which is the individuated, right, the calcified, crystallized being, and once it has this recursion within it, which he calls, the aesthetics of aesthetics, there's this kind of vital recursion. It grows in autonomy, and that, so it preserves that threefold structure. Is essentially what I'm getting at.
Just add something.
Yeah.
It's important because it's very important because even Simondon, at least in my understanding, reserves the realm of the psychology, the social, and the historical as
To the trans individual.
the trans-individual,
Yeah.
to the human.
Mhm.
The human shared with other objects,
Mm, I see
but
what you're
he
saying.
does not equal them at all.
right.
The example of the clay and the brick, you know, there is still a distinction between individuated objects and how the individuated mind.
That's true to an extent, but he even says of crystals, as crystals are forming, he says a crystal lives on its edge, even that a crystal is social on its edge. So I would challenge that he does include germs of the trans individual in prior stages. But maybe we can talk about that more later. Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
but it's always great to nerd out about Simondon. So.
I think that's a great place to
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.